The year is 878 AD. Anglo-Saxon England is being ravaged by the Great Heathen Army, who are a collection of Norsemen from various Scandinavian countries, most notably from Denmark, who have come to England for several reasons. The main accepted reason for the invasion was to settle in England due to better farming conditions, and the other for revenge. According to legend, the great Viking Ragnar Lothbrok was executed by Elia of Northumbria. His death caused 3 of his 5 sons to rise up and create the great heathen army to avenge their father. The kingdoms of Mercia and Northumberland were the first to collapse under the assault by the great heathen army. The only Saxon kingdom left to challenge the heathen army was Wessex, led by Alfred the Great. The usual tactic to dealing with the Viking raiders was to pay them off. However, as circumstances had changed, the kings of Mercia and Northumbria couldn't stand the might of the Vikings. Once those territories were conquered, the great heathen army split in two, as the armies were commanded by various Viking leaders of different tribes, each desiring their own provinces. One of the main leaders, Halfdan, led part of the army north to harass the Picts, as well as to settle and divide the lands of Northumbria between his men, as they had reached their goal of capturing more fertile lands to farm. The rest of the army led by Guthrum went south and attacked the Kingdom of Wessex, after defeating and conquering Mercia. Despite an uneasy peace between Guthrum and Alfred after Alfred had paid the Vikings off, raiding ceased for a short time before the Vikings continued raiding the coasts of England. Alfred's forces were resting for the winter in Chippingham, a historical market town at the time, when they were attacked by the Vikings. Taken off guard by the attack, most of Alfred's forces were destroyed, and Alfred barely escaped before taking refuge in the swamps of North Wiltshire. Now having to resort to guerrilla tactics, Alfred spent the rest of the winter trying to rally what men he could from the rest of his kingdom. From spring onward, Alfred had mustered an army capable of taking on the Vikings. Finally meeting the Vikings at the small village of Edington, where Guthrum laid down the challenge by holding a defensive position atop a hill, presenting the Saxons with a solid shield wall. As the tactic for this age was to form a shield wall and march slowly towards the enemy, then engage in a bloody melee. This tactic was incredibly effective for the Vikings over the centuries. The equipment the Vikings wielded were mostly iron axes, swords and spears, sturdy wooden shield and basic mail or leather armour. As most of the common Vikings were farmers, only the rich were able to carry swords and wear mail armour. The rest were equipped with axes as they were easy to make and maintain over swords, and leather armour again being cheaper to make and maintain. The Saxon army's equipment was nearly identical to the Vikings, the main difference being most Saxon freemen had several spears, some for throwing before engaging the enemy and the other for close combat. The numbers for both sides are historically inconclusive. There's no definitive figure. However, we can estimate that the Saxons had around 2,500 men and the Vikings had about 1,500, yet the Vikings were more battle-hardened and experienced than the Saxon freemen. After lining up his army, Alfred's troops marched towards the Viking shield wall and the Battle of Edington began. With a slow march in a single line formation, the Saxons clashed with the Vikings. Both sides were compacted in a dense shield wall, both sides trying to move under extreme weight. Clashes and shouts bathed the quiet countryside. With spears thrusting through any gap, axe swinging downwards, men roaring at each other, the battle was a long, hard fight with both sides going back and forth. The Viking plan of tiring out the Saxons with a prolonged melee was failing as the Saxons fought with everything on the line. The battle raged for nearly all day, with each side trying to wear one another down. Despite the Vikings being the superior fighters, the Saxons' morale was high, and with the tight compounds of the shield wall, the Saxons were able to take advantage of their higher numbers. Eventually, gaps in the Viking line were opening. Seeing that he was losing the battle, Guthrum ordered a general retreat back towards the fort of Chippingham, where Alfred pursued Guthrum and besieged the fort for 14 days. Eventually, the Vikings were starved out. Despite this victory, Alfred knew further fighting was too risky, as another loss would result in him being back to square one, plus the fact the Vikings were just too entrenched in northern England now to be driven out. Using his recent victory, Alfred made Guthrum sign the Peace of Wedmore. With this agreement, Wessex was stabilised, while Guthrum was christened, and the Vikings headed north to East Anglia to settle. With Wessex firmly established, raiding stopped for the rest of Alfred's reign, and his descendants would later unify England, with Queen Elizabeth II being one of his descendants. Thank you for watching our documentary on the Battle of Edington. This battle was filmed using assets from Attila Total War and the Age of Charlemagne DLC. If you'd like to see more documentaries like this, please consider liking and subscribing, and we'll see you for the next documentary. Thank you very much.